Good morning. Yeah, I'm Jessica Kerr, Jessitron Online, and I want to talk about experimenting in sociotechnical systems. So by sociotechnical systems, I mean systems that involve people and things that we build and then use, which is like pretty much everything. But in particular, I'm interested in the sociotechnical systems that create software. So software teams and organizations and every scope from like me as a programmer working on my own laptop with the code up to the distributed systems and the teams that support it and the users that use it. And by experimenting, well, here we are in the Science Center. We love science. Science is how we learn as a culture. Experiments are like the little granular means of that, of how we learn in the small. Now, in my work in software, I don't spend all my time doing explicitly experiments just to learn. Might do a little of that, but mostly I'm taking action, I'm making changes in the system in which I participate, the sociotechnical system. I might be changing the code, I might be talking to the people, which changes them. I want to think of all of that as experimenting too, because I want to continue to learn from it. I want my actions and my perceptions and my ways of thinking to continually update. I want my work to create a knowledge flow, like Diana talked about this morning, so that I continually get better at doing this work. So a lot of this talk is about how do I make my everyday work more experiment-y. I love working at Honeycomb for two reasons. One, Honeycomb does observability. It's about helping you figure out what's going on inside your software. And that's crucial to the sociotechnical system, so that's why I went to work there. But I also love it because at Honeycomb we have a company value called everything is an experiment. We like to view all of our work as experiments. We like it so much, it's like an official company value on our webpage. Blah, 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 blah. It's what we learn that matters. What we learn is not the only thing that matters. Like, we're not in this just to learn. We're in it to help other developers learn as long as they pay us for that. So we are taking action to like continually improve the system that we're in and make it produce more value and also take in more value. But while we're doing that action, if we think of everything we're doing as an experiment, then we will look at the outcomes and we will learn from them and get better at it as we go along. So the worst that can happen is we learn something. There's a couple of things that bother me about this as a company value. One is that little logo, it's very cute, but why is the liquid going up in a like wave motion in that Erlenmeyer flask? I like to think it's to remind me to look for surprise, to look for things that don't make sense and update my theories. But the other thing is, everybody thinks about experiments differently, and some people are like, well, this means we should A/B test every change. Please don't. That's not the thing. We need to chaos experiment all the things. No, how about some of the things? So I've come to notice that experiment-iness means something different at different scales of the sociotechnical system. So today I'm talking about 4 categories of experiment at 4 different scales that we can incorporate into our everyday work as a way of increasing our knowledge flows through what we do. I got into software through, spoiler. The key takeaway is everything is an experiment if we look at the results. I got into software through bachelor's in physics. And so I think it's really fun to think of everything as an experiment, because I remember having fun doing experiments in physics lab, where we would do things like, here's like an inclined plane, and there's a ball, and you're going to let go of the ball, and it's going to roll down and bang against this block, and you're going to time that and see if you can measure the acceleration of gravity, roughly. And then so you do that, and you write all this in your lab notebook, and then you write down all the results, and I did this by hand when I was in school, of course. And then you compare it against what your expectations were, and you calculate a percentage of error. Now, some qualities of this experiment include that we state our expectations. If you say what's going to happen, okay, this time I deployed something, and I think when I run it, I'm going to see the same error message, but it'll have more information in it. Or this time I'm going to get a new error message. State your expectations before you run something. In this particular experiment, that is exemplified by the calculated values of the acceleration of the ball going down the hill based on a theory. So part of stating our expectations is that they need to come from a theory. And the more explicit you can be about that theory, the more you can recognize that you believe the theory. Well, okay, in this case, we're going to keep believing the theory. So we hold a theory, which is A equals G sine theta, provided by teacher. Now, in that sense, this physics experiment is not very experimenty, because we don't actually look at the results and update our theory. No, we calculate an error, and we're very happy that the error was consistent from one to the other. Okay, that's not how I do it in my work, actually, because I have theories about how my software works, and I need to believe those theories enough to take action, to make code changes, to deploy stuff, but not believe them too much, to also hold them tentatively and believe that somewhere in my concepts of how the software works, I'm wrong. And if I'm not wrong today, I will be soon, because stuff will change. So we need to have a theory. The more explicit we can be about that, the more easily we can update it based on the results of our experimenty work. Okay, so this is systematic testing and measurement, both in the lab notebook, and this is something that actually really helped me throughout my developer career, including really early, because systematic testing and measurement is super useful when I'm either figuring out how to use a library, how it works. I can read the docs for the theory, but then I need to go try it out constantly. And it also helps me as I'm changing code. For instance, we can state our expectations. The clearest example of state our expectations for an experimentiness is test-driven development. You don't care about what's in these tests. They're just some tests. If you write your tests first, then you are very clearly stating your expectation of what your code will do. And then you run them and they fail. And you're like, yes, I expected that. And then the beauty of software as opposed to physics. This is my favorite thing about software engineering versus the natural sciences, is then I go and I change the world and I make my expectations true. Yes! And then the tests pass, and then I am happy and I feel powerful. So I love that. We don't just do science, we change science within the very specific world that we're working in of our particular software. Except, of course, when it doesn't work and the test continues to fail, whether I like it or not, and I don't like it, and I'm like, something about my theory is wrong. So then I go and I insert a scientific instrument. So if you read history of science, a lot of the progression of science is governed by better and better instruments. So we can understand germs because we have microscopes and we can see them. We can understand nuclear physics because we can detect neutrons flying around and other subatomic particles. And in software, we get to build our own instruments, and it's as easy as adding a line of code. There it is. In this case, a console.log. Although here I've deliberately inserted a scientific instrument, there's a better way to do this, which is dropping into the debugger. And the debugger is like putting on glasses or getting out your telescope or something and being able to see widely and see everything that's relevant right in front of you and explore. So the debugger is actually kind of the universal best scientific instrument for this. But a console.log also works. Right, so once I do that, I can use my new investigative tools to update my theory of the world, figure out what's going on, and then make the test pass. And it depends on me holding a theory and being able to change that. And that I'm able to change it because I have looked at the results. Continuous integration. So the tests exist to do the experiments, right? And we put them in continuous integration, and we make the build fail in order to force us to look at the results. So that's useful. And the other thing is locally, how many times am I going to have to learn, read the error message, Jess? Read the error message, the whole error message. Yes, I know you just saw it, but read it again because the fact that there's an error there tells me I'm wrong about something. So use the clues available to me. Another thing that we do in software, and this has developed over the course of my career, is we get better at describing the environment. Now, in that physics experiment, we described the environment with a nice little picture with measurements and everything, and one thing we've stated here is that we think this is everything that's relevant to the results of the experiment. We didn't specify, we left the assumption that this is on Earth, because if you did the same thing on the moon, it would take a different amount of time for the ball to roll. But we've stated everything that we think is relevant. And we do that in software too. To express runs on my box, we can now define my box with a Docker file. And I love that. And then further, we can specify how that Docker was deployed in Docker Compose or in Terraform or something else scary. But we've gotten a lot better at describing the environment with all of reproduced. Don't look at this. It's Terraform. But with infrastructure as code, it's really important that we're able to describe the environment that we expect our expectations to be true in. And that's really important at all levels of experimenting because, nothing's true everywhere. It always depends, and we're specifying what it depends on. Okay, so we've described the environment, and this works pretty darn well at the level of one program and a controlled environment that we can test in. And this is a really important technique, but it doesn't scale up. Once we put that program into production in a distributed system, we can't have such clear expectations that get met every time. There's always going to be network failures. The software around us is deploying and changing at a different scale. Maybe we integrate with generative AI, which is explicitly non-deterministic. And then there might be people involved. There's all kinds of stuff in a production system, a production distributed system, that's different. So we can't rely only on systematic testing and measurement. Your end-to-end tests aren't testing everything. Don't even think about it. The only person testing everything, the only person getting closest to testing everything is your users. So instead, measure and adjust. And that means, looking at your observability data. I have a fun example of that. A few weeks ago, Martin Holman at Honeycomb, he wanted to do something involving our database of sessions. And he happened to look at a graph of the free space on our session DB, the RDS instance that holds sessions for us. And he noticed that it's like at 15 gigs at the beginning of the month and closer to 10 at the end. And so in 2 months and change, we're going to run out of free space. No more sessions for us. So he's like, well, that's bad. And he tried going into the database and deleting the sessions, and databases are weird. That didn't change this at all. So he's like, okay, well, where are all these sessions coming from? So he ran a query in Honeycomb about this is in our instance of Honeycomb that monitors production Honeycomb. He ran a query. He's like, okay, what are all the events where the db.query includes sessions? And he can see there's some selects and some inserts. This, by the way, is a scientific instrument. The fact that we emit this field and that we emit these events, that's a line of code somewhere, a line of instrumentation code to emit this telemetry data. And when you instrument your code in production, you are setting up all of your experiments later. So great observability is the debugger of production if you have a lot of attributes and on all the and events for all the important units of work. You can ask these questions. So he asked, all right, what are we doing with the sessions DB? Let's narrow it down to just the inserts, and he's counting the inserts. And this graph says there's like 20,000 inserts per hour in the session DB, and we're like, no, because, I mean, if we have 2,000 users at a time, that's busy. That's like middle of the day in North America. So this is like a good order of magnitude too many. So where are they all coming from? So he clicks on one, and that takes him into a trace. And the trace shows him that there's some stuff going on, but there's no user in this session, he notices. And why would we keep a session if there's no user? And the answer is in this middle span here, because we have to record the redirect URL. Because if someone hits Honeycomb and they're not logged in, we're going to take them to the login page, but we need to say where to send them after they succeed at logging in. Okay, but what is the redirect URL? Yeah, it's slash. Well, that's boring. That's where you are going to wind up anyway. How many of our redirect URLs in these session insertions are slash? And you can count those. And the answer is 6 million out of 6 million and change. So that's not good. Why are we bothering? So he's like, okay, now his hypothesis is if I stop inserting on the ones that don't actually need to redirect at all, maybe we won't have so many sessions created. And sure enough, this is a count of inserts, so you can see where he implemented his change. And that's good. And then he can go back and say how many redirects are slash. None of them. This is a great example of looking at the results of a deployment, because this is what he wanted to change, and he can see that there's none of those. And then he can go and look at the space, and you can see where he deployed it. And you can see that the free space is now higher and going down very, very slowly relative to what it was. So that's pretty cool. The other thing about like having observability and starting from an observation that you can make with the scientific instruments that you've inserted into your code is that you can go back and check the results later. And much later, I can go back and run this graph now. Okay, so this tells us to look at the results, especially the ones we didn't expect. He was looking at the session DB stuff for some other reason, and he noticed an anomaly. And so he started with that observation of, wait a minute, this is not as I expect. I need to update my theory, but how? And he was able to dive into further. And so he's able to hold a new theory about how this works, and then, even better, update reality to match his old theory, which we liked better. So that's fun about programming. And he started from the observation. So if you know what triggered your work, why you're doing this at all, that makes it more experimenty. What about the world is not as you would prefer it that leads you to undertake this experiment? Okay. And then when users get involved, it gets even more interesting. So the distributed system, we can measure and adjust, and we need to look at that stuff. But when people get involved, we have even less predictability. Sadly, I cannot go insert some instrumentation in my people to be like, tell me when you get an error message. No, I can make the software do that, but I can't make it be like, tell me when you can't find the button. Or tell me when you can't see these colors, or stuff like that. So finding out what influences user behavior, which is what we want to change. We want to change how much value they're getting and how much they use the tool and stuff like that. This is something else. And then we get to the level of we're talking about social systems that we really don't control. We cannot describe the environment of which users are which people and why are they using our software this way. And so you get into the realm of, we can check the effects of what we do. And the gold standard in checking the effects in a very broad system where you don't really control the participants is the randomized controlled trial in medicine, where you take a control group of people and you do nothing. Or you tell them they're getting the treatment. And then you take another group of people and you actually give them the treatment. And then you look for effects, including surprise. For instance, here's a survey a clinical trial that my doctor told me about 15 years ago when I was like done having kids and I wanted some birth control, and he's like, here's this new method. It's super non-invasive. They did a clinical trial and there were no unintended pregnancies and no noticed side effects. So we highly recommended it based on this trial. And that's great. The point of this controlled trial is you take half of the people and you don't give them the thing, and you take half the people and you do, and then you're like, do they get more cancer? Do they have more heart attacks? So you're looking for, and did it have the effect we wanted? You're looking for all of that. So we can do that with our users in A/B tests, but first I want to talk about doing that deeper in our software, because this is a fun example of checking the effects of an intervention. So in Honeycomb, we run a lot of lambdas. Every time somebody runs a query in our product, we have a custom database. And if the query is over a time span of more than, say, the last 2 hours, we're probably going to be retrieving data off S3. But we want that to be almost as fast as if we had it on local disk, like the last 2 hours. So we spin up lambdas to go retrieve all the data off of S3 and do all the aggregations at query time and do all the derived column calculations and bring it all back, which is really cool and interesting and expensive, and unpredictably expensive too. So when Amazon a couple years ago released a new architecture to make lambdas faster and cheaper, and faster means cheaper and cheaper means cheaper, and we're like, yes, we were one of the first to try it at scale. So we're moving from AMD to ARM architecture, and first we split it up, and we're like, okay, half of our Lambda executions are going to ARM and half are going to AMD, and we control all of this population, so we can do that. And let's see, right. And then here's a graph of the results. The top graph is the slowest ones, the P99. The orange line is the new architecture. So you can see that there's higher peaks, both at P99, the slowest ones, and the second graph is the average, or median rather, the P50. And there, we can zoom in on the numbers. They're slower. They're slower, and when they're slow, when they're a lot slow, they're even more slow. So this was a bummer. It negated any cost difference. It was not cheaper, and it was less predictable in its performance. So here's Liz in Slack reducing the feature flag so that instead of saying 50% to ARM, we're sending 1% to ARM. Make sure we can still do it. Make sure that keeps working, but send everything to the old architecture. Now, feature flags here function as scientific instruments. So at this scale of where you're testing the effects, in this case it's the distributed system, but it also works with the users, where you're checking the effects of an intervention, feature flags are the best instrument you can have. They're your telescope, they're your microscope. And we're able to adjust which side of an if statement, there's an if statement somewhere, which of these lambdas should I spin up, which side of the if statement each execution goes through. In this case, just based on a random distribution, but you can do it on customer, and you can do it on plan level, or whatever it is you need. So feature flags, awesome. Now, another element of experimentiness here is that we're willing to back up. The feature flag gave us the capability, and Liz wasn't married to running our lambdas on ARM. It was only if it worked. So being willing to back up gives us a great reason to look at the results, and makes our work a lot more like an experiment. Right, so then Liz goes and she looks at why are these slower? They're not supposed to be slower, and there were a couple things. One was capacity. AWS didn't have as many of these processors, so we couldn't spin up 10,000 lambdas instantaneously like we like to do. The Golang at the time had some language features that were not present in the ARM distribution that are a useful optimization. So we bumped our version of Go to the at the time pre-release 118. And then a third one was a library that was not optimized for the new processor. It was still just converting the old instructions to the new ones. And so Liz went into that project and put in a pull request and got it merged so the compression library would work faster on ARM and take advantage of the new processor. All of these things in place. Here's our current execution levels. And now the new one, the ARM, is purple. And at the top we have a count, so you can see we're running 99% ARM and just a little bit of the old one. We don't want to break it. We want to make sure it keeps working in case we need it again. And then the durations are very similar. And crucially, the relative cost is significantly lower for the ARM chips. So now we're saving that money. But it wasn't immediate. You know, we tried a system change and then we had to back it out because the other elements of the wider system weren't ready. Go wasn't ready for this new chip. LZ4 wasn't ready for this new chip. And Amazon wasn't ready for us to use it in quite this quantity. So a big part of the experimentiness is your change small enough or slow enough for the rest of the system to adjust to work with it. And this keeping it compatible is a challenge in our work, and it slows us down, but it's valuable. This is why we do migrations. This is why we have backwards compatibility. This is why Google, for it felt like 3 months, had we're going to change the login screen warning, right? And then a few weeks ago, it changed to, we have changed the login screen, until I hit dismiss on all the different browsers. Because people have expectations. So a big part of keeping it compatible is keeping it compatible with the user's expectations that they have. So let's talk about an example with actual users involved and their expectations. Navbar reorder. So this is the green team. The green team is focused on growth, and they want new users of Honeycomb to get value as quickly as possible. And here's their theory of how that happens. 1, you create an account. 2, you send data to Honeycomb. This is like your software is emitting telemetry and it's getting into our database. So, clues. So eventually we want you to get clues about how your software works. We call it, sometimes unofficially, we call it the MTTWF, mean time to what the fuck. How long does it take from getting data into Honeycomb until you say, no, that's not how it works? Oh crap, that's how it works? But what happens in between here? So their hypothesis was that you need to at least run a query. You're not going to get value until you run a query. That's what we want people to do. And so then, okay, so that's their theory, expectation, we want them to run a query, but let's make some observations. What do they actually do? And we go into Amplitude, which is a tool that shows your path, people's paths through the system, and they find out that they actually pretty often get here. Settings. Default granularity. No, this is not what you want. You almost never want this, and you definitely don't want it yet. And how did they get at this page? Well, it's because it's like right up there, data sets is like at the top of the list, and they're like, oh, data sets, maybe that's like tables, maybe that's how I drill down into your data. No, it isn't. It's actually this settings page. So the green team is like, oh, well, maybe we can fix this. And so they're like, what if we move data sets to the bottom, call it what it is, data settings, and then a couple other adjustments to the navbar. But changing the navbar is, this is not as serious as Google changing its login page, but it's up there for the scope of Honeycomb. You can't just go changing the navbar willy-nilly. People have muscle memory. And if you're going to change it, you want to be sure it's worth it. So they're like, okay, let's test this. Let's describe the environment. The environment is all new free users of Honeycomb. Because having like a free tier, we have a free tier that's like 20 million events a month. A lot of companies never even exceed that. So they just use it for their observability, if you're small enough, which is great. And what we get out of that is people to run tests on. because there's no sales rep who's like, oh, don't run that on my user, leave my user alone. No, nobody cares about free users. Do what you want with them. We care that it's working, but we're going to test our UI changes on you. It's fine. You're getting plenty of value. It's worth it. So we're going to take half of the new free users and show them only the new nav bar, and we're going to let the other half continue with the old nav bar. And so that's our control in our test group, and we're going to check the effects of this intervention. And sure enough, this is like the new nav bar. They barely clicked on data settings, and the old nav bar continued clicking on it like all the frickin' time. And then other good things happened. They clicked like more on SLOs and triggers, and that's more likely to get them to clues and value than data settings. And did they run more queries? Maybe. I mean, it's a few, but it's not statistically significant. But we definitely didn't hurt their ability to run a query. So we think it's a net win. And so the green team brought these results to the rest of the company, and everybody's like, yay, that's great. Change the nav bar for everybody. And so we did. That's the new nav bar now, the current nav bar. It won't be new forever. And then we wanted to keep it compatible, so we didn't, change it forward and back for everybody. But there's another form of compatibility, which is compatibility to the rest of the internal system. Our researcher, Justin Threlkeld, divulges that sometimes with these A/B test kind of things, it's not so much that you're not sure. Are they going to click on data sets less? You named it data settings and you moved it to the bottom. Yes, they're going to click on it. Yes, less. That's just duh. Nobody's really disputing that, except the thing is that when you have like a politically charged change, and every item on that nav bar has a team behind it at Honeycomb, and no team wants their item on the nav bar moved down, but they can't argue with the numbers. So sometimes you make an explicit experiment like this, not because, you'll look for surprise, but not so much to find out whether it's going to work as to convince the people with the decision-making power, who will be convinced by numbers and not by your expertise. And that's a compatibility with the wider social system. So the software is part of a sociotechnical system, my favorite sociotechnical system, that is us as developers and product and design and operations and everything, all the people necessary to keep it running and under change. And then the running software in production. The running software in production I look at as part of the team. And this is the particular sociotechnical system that I really want to make changes in. And this system is a semathesy. So semathesy is a word coined by Nora Bateson, anthropologist, and it means a learning system made of learning parts, as distinguished from any system that you might think is mechanical or predictable in any way. Our team is a learning system made of learning parts, because all of us are learning all the time. We learn from each other, and I include the running software inside this semathesy because it's learning from us, we change it, and we learn from it, from all of those traces and graphs and the changes it makes to the database and indirectly the customers that call in complaining. So we learn from our software, and it learns from us, and we learn from each other, and so on. And if we can maximize those flows of learning, or as Diana said this morning, those knowledge flows, then we can get better and better at doing our work together, us and the software. We need that running software up to fulfill our purpose of providing valued capabilities to people in the world. Okay, so in this semathesy, I want to do experiments. I want to gradually change the work and then say, is this working, and get better at it as I go. I want to do experimenty things. But I definitely am not going to use randomized controlled trials. For one, every semathesy is different. As we learn within our team and as we code in our software, we naturally diverge from other teams. And we can't just carbon copy that. We develop our own inside jokes and our own, in domain-driven design, our own ubiquitous language that is about our code and our business domain, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need every symanthice to be the same. I do need to keep it getting better. But because no two are the same, and any change I make immediately changes the system, because we've just learned something and now we're different than we were a month ago, I cannot use randomized controlled trials. And now, here is a treatise from a real scientist. Well, Megan Stevenson here has her PhD in statistical methods as applies to the social sciences, particularly criminal justice. And her paper, Cause, Effect, and the Structure of the Social World, says that randomized controlled trials, they don't teach us anything. Yes, you can get published and maybe you can get tenure, but we're not actually learning anything about the world from 50 years of randomized controlled trials. Because anything we change, in her case, mainly in criminal justice, socializing forces push people back toward the path they would have been on absent the intervention. The wider system squashes any sort of change. You can see this in Agile. If you get like an actual lowercase a Agile team, I can umbrella manage and create an Agile team, and the people in it can be happy and they can get stuff done until the rest of the organization eventually squashes it. What that team learns will not transfer. You can't copy the processes from one team over to another team. That's like copying their inside jokes. Well, they have a Wookiee that goes woo woo when the build is broken. So if you have a Wookiee that goes woo woo when the build is broken, clearly you'll deploy more often. No, it doesn't work that way. That kind of copying, and that's in social sciences, that would be called a replication crisis, or in psychology, the same intervention doesn't just transfer. The parts of the intervention that we know how to write down don't just transfer. And this leads to, Stevenson cites the iron law of evaluation. The expected value of any net impact assessment of any large-scale social program is 0. This isn't her, this is 20 years old. This is a known fact in the social sciences, that as much as we want evidence-based policy, the evidence that we're basing it on doesn't transfer. Because all of our social systems are symmatheses, and it's through the learning, through the knowledge flows that we change, not through copying small interventions. By their nature, any randomized controlled trial intervention has to be compatible with the rest of the system, which means it's not changing the rest of the system, which means the rest of the system is going to squash it. Okay, so no randomized controlled trials. They're not helpful. Oh yeah, and speaking of which, that randomized controlled trial on Escher, this is like one from last year, because in like 2018 they did a couple more studies and discovered all kinds of like allergic reactions and one death and an unintended pregnancy, and they took it off the market. And I'm fine. I don't have any problems. But this teaches me to keep looking at the results. Whoever implemented our SessionDB initially, it worked totally fine. They put it into production. Years later, Martin goes back and looks at the results now, and it's like, oh crap, good thing I noticed this before we run out of space on the SessionDB. So keep looking at the results and keep updating your theories. And it's enough to use something because it's working now. Just come back and see if it's still working later. Yeah. Okay, so in our sociotechnical systems, we want to do some experiments, or we want to work experimentally. And randomized controlled trials aren't it. What is? And the answer is action research. This is something that's been around since the 50s, but it's finally spreading and we're getting better at it. I learned about action research from Brené Brown. In one of the appendices of her books, I think it was this one, she describes her research methods. Now, Brené Brown does research into feelings of wholeness and vulnerability and generally like meaning in human lives, which is very different from medicine. And she does this not with numbers, but with surveys, or interviews rather. She interviews people, and then she listens to their answers, listens really closely, and develops new questions and goes and investigates those, not just numbers. In a symathesis, numbers aren't going to cut it. I mean, there's some numbers that are worth tracking and checking for surprise, but they're not going to get us the depth of knowledge that we need about our particular situation. Action research is less about holding a single theory than continually evolving your ideas of how the team works, how we're interacting, how we're doing. You have to keep making observation and then checking and working. But we can do this in our teams. Example, the Agile retrospective, lowercase a Agile again. In my opinion, if you actually want a team that can create software well, the one Agile ceremony to implement is the retrospective. Because if we're looking back on how we work together, thinking about how we might work together better, and then checking in again a week later on how that's working and just tweaking stuff and looking at the results by asking people, then we will continually get better and we can learn. And then your symathesis starts to diverge from all of the others, but you are able to work well with each other and with your software. And that's a great thing. So I love Agile retrospectives. I would be remiss if I didn't mention domain-driven design, which is the only software methodology paradigm kind of thing that explicitly connects the social and technical systems, in their case through a ubiquitous language that you use both with the people and the code. Also, their conferences are full of systems thinking talks, so I love them. But for a more concrete example, here is my partner Avdi is working with a team of developers, and it's a small team, and about a year ago, I guess, he was noticing that there's one developer, let's call him Nate, who was with the system since the beginning. Over 10 years, he wrote this thing. And he is able to do stuff, if you can get him to focus. But meanwhile, there's some other people on the team, the blue and green developer in this picture, who are approaching it with less development experience, but more importantly, way less experience on this software system. And they're not able to do anything. They just can't get any changes made. And Avdi's like, I observe that all of the knowledge of the system resides in Nate's head. He has all the permissions for everything, he has the access to everything, and he knows where to look, and he knows how to test, and nobody else knows anything. And he's like, let's try ensemble programming. So ensemble programming, also known as mob programming, is where the whole team works in one group. Everybody's looking at one screen, whether remotely or in person, in his case remotely. One person is typing, but that person is not allowed to make decisions. The decisions have to come from the rest of the team, the decisions of what to type. That could be as low level as close that file and open this other one, or as high level as, create a new class and put that function in it, depending on the expertise of the person typing. But all decisions are voiced, and Avdi, he totally got this from me, but we believe that ensemble programming is the best way to maximize knowledge flow between people on the teams, because you're all sharing all this information, you're doing it together. And he's like, maybe this will work, maybe it'll help, let's just try it for an hour or two. So they tried it for an hour or two. The surprise was people loved it. Everybody loved it. Nate loved it because he loves to share information. He's not one of those evil purple developers that hoards information. He loves to share it. And the blue and green developers were like, we understand what's going on. This is great. And so they did almost entirely ensemble programming for months. And now they don't do it all the time, but it's still a tool that they have in their arsenal. So that was a successful experiment. I can use this as an example to tell you what I do for a socio-technical experiment at the team level when I'm trying to be as experimenty as possible. To do that, before I do the change, I think about these things. First of all, what's my observation to trigger this? In this case, it was nobody but Nate can get anything done. And then, what's my theory of why this is happening? What's my characterization of the situation? And in Avdi's case, it was, I think all the knowledge is in Nate's head, and everybody else doesn't know enough about where everything else is in the system, etc. And bonus, once you are explicit about your theory, you can often test it more easily than whatever the heck you were about to do. For instance, you can say, what would be true if this is true? And Avdi can ask Nate, hey, first let's ask blue and green. Hey, this particular change in the system that we want to make, how are you going to do that? And they're like, well, I think we need to make the change here, but I don't know what else that will affect, and I don't know how to test it, so I have no idea how long it'll take. And then Avdi asks the same question of Nate, and he's like, obviously, you just change this one thing, and you test it like this, and blah, you're done. It should take 5 minutes. It doesn't take 5 minutes, but those answers express a different level of confidence and would confirm Avdi's characterization of the knowledge all being in one place. Your scientific instrument, your telescope, your microscope, your thing that lets you explore all kinds of different theories here is your relationships with the people on the team and outside the team if for integrations, because that lets you ask questions and get real answers. So investing in comfortable relationships with people throughout the software organization pays off by letting you check how things are really working. Okay, but back to this example. What action is Avdi going to take? Well, he's going to try ensemble programming with the team. And why does he think that will work? That's another question to force yourself to answer, to be rigorous about this. And in his case, it would have been enough to say, it worked for this other team, let's try it. Because what's the cost? An hour or two? That's good enough. He actually does have a theory about how ensemble programming increases knowledge flow through the team. So that's even better. And finally, state the expectation, and how are we going to check whether it worked? Not measure. That's for the software. We're talking about people here. How can we notice whether it worked? So he can say, okay, what might he notice if it's working? People are asking questions, and he hears in the ensemble, oh, so that's how you do that. And, oh, I didn't know that trick, and stuff like that. If it isn't working, maybe one person's talking all the time, that would make you not want to do this anymore. And finally, what should we keep an eye on? Keep an eye on the overall productivity of the team, and make sure we're not getting even less done than when we weren't working in an ensemble. So if you think about all these things beforehand, and then you try your experiment, and then you come back, and you look, were your expectations met? And if not, or in which areas they were not, how can you update your theory? And what might you try again? And is it worth backing it out? Or shall we just roll forward with this? But in reality, most of my work, I'm not making it that experimenty. I'm not being rigorous enough to make all of that stuff explicit before I start. I'll settle for what's the worst that can happen. And in this case, it's like, what's the worst that can happen? We spent 2 hours and it wasn't fun. That's it. And if what's the worst that can happen is, it didn't work, whatever, I lost an hour. Please experiment away, because when we find a surprise and we update our model of the world, the long tail of success is very long, and if the failure consequences are low, then it's enough that the worst that can happen is that we learn something. Because the semathecy feeds on learning. It feeds on those knowledge flows. This is how it gets healthier. This is how it gets bigger. This is really what I'm going for. Because as a software developer, it's not about me. It's not just about the code. It's about all of us and what we become together and what we can put out into the world to add capabilities. And we will become great from that. Because the last experimenty quality that I want to talk about is everything is an experiment if we let it change us. Learning is a form of change. if we go forward in the world with more understanding and with better critical thinking skills and with more relationships and more ideas, then we're winning. That's what I want out of my work that is also an experiment. Okay, so if that works, how do we scale it up? How do we scale up these socio-technical system experiments like the ensemble programming, like in our Agile retrospectives? Yeah, no, you don't. The iron law of evaluation says, if it is small enough to be considered an experiment, it will not change the system. An experiment is compatible with the rest of the system, which means it will not change the larger system. If you want to change the larger system, if you want meaningful systemic change that's going to make your whole organization more capable of developing quality software with good quality of life, and everybody's learning and the software is good and your customers are happy, this is the closest thing I've ever seen to something that might work. Okay, this is a talk from Agile 2022 by Beth Andersbeck, and it wasn't recorded, but Z made a video and put it up on Gumroad because I begged them to do this, because this talk contains the only recipes I've ever seen that really give me hope that we, as software developers, can change and improve the systems we live in, like significantly, like systemic change. It talks about how to build new structures, not the hierarchy, not more hierarchy, and you have to build them from within because the hierarchy can only build more hierarchy. We have to build them from the individual contributor level. As part of the culture we want to change, we can influence that system. It talks about building structures that can reproduce themselves, not by copying, but organically, closer to biological reproduction. And it talks about replacing standards, rigid standards, with norms, a fabric of norms that flex to the different environment, to the different circumstance, while pulling together, because we're people and we actually do that really well, given the opportunity. We do like to agree with each other. So radical culture of culture building, I cannot summarize this, I can only point you to it. This is bigger than an experiment, this is about real change. And and this link, by the way, at Gumroad, you actually have to put in money to get the video. Please give Beth money. You can give here $10, it's fine. Because that's how we're going to make change in the wider system, in some of them anyway, and that is what I want to do. In the meantime, you know what? If I have created an Agile team as an umbrella manager, worst case, I made some people's lives better for a couple years, and when the wider system squashes them, they'll all disperse and go work at a company where they can't actually work together. And that's not nothing. And in the meantime, we probably built some good software, which was probably canceled by the powers that be. But what do you do? What do you do? So these are my 4 levels of experimentation, and I can think about my work as an experiment in different ways at different scales. And these are all ways that contribute. Oh, and of all of these experimentiness characteristics, the most important is we look at the results. Because if we look at the results, we will be changed. If we really look at them, then they will change us. Oh, and I forgot. Right, so we're in the Science Center. I've talked a lot about experiments, but if you actually want to do science, you can't do that alone. Science is not something an individual does, it is something a culture does. So, take your results and share them. Remember, we're not doing randomized controlled trials here. That's not what we have, but we do have experiences. And we can share those with each other rigorously in the sense of expressing our theory and what we expected and what really happened and what was important about our particular team and environment that maybe influenced the outcome of this particular intervention. Because just because it doesn't work for you doesn't mean it doesn't work. I swear, TDD works for some people, even if you hated it. Same with pairing, same with ensemble. Different environments. Different things work. But if we can express under what circumstances this works, then we can find patterns and we can use this, and we can grow and learn, not just as an individual, not just as a team, but as an industry, as a culture. And then all of these techniques are things I use to get better at participating in a semathesy, at participating for change, which is what I consider my real job. As a semathicist, someone who participates in a learning system in order to increase those flows of learning, in order to make it better. Because it's not just about the learning. The learning is to take action, and the actions are to promote learning, to take better actions, and so on. It keeps going. It's a semathesy. Yes. Thank you. This is at the top of my blog, and there's the QR code, and oh, crap. Okay, I ran out of time. That is supposed to say, everything is an experiment if you look at the results.
You're talking a lot about looking back at the results of metrics and things like that. Is the right way to do that with alerts and observability systems?
Well, I'm going to tell you observability is the way to look at your results, yeah.
Like, should you be adding like tons and tons of alerts to look back on
not
this?
Alerts.
Okay.
Screw alerts, no. Alerts are for emergencies when things have degraded enough that you need to wake up. Or I mean, like, okay, I'm actually fine with Slack alerts, that wait for business hours. But do instrument your code so that, and I'll do this locally. I'll be like, okay, how am I going to know this is working when I make a change? And I'll stick a line in there that's, or usually it's add an attribute of, okay, I'm adding a feature to give you, I don't know, better autocomplete of something. And I'm going to add something, what did we autocomplete from to? And then once I add that, I can use it to test locally, and I can see what happened there. And then once it gets into the test environment and in production, I still have that. And I can go back after it's deployed and say, how many people used this autocomplete? How many characters did it add? Did it save them typing? And I find it really satisfying as a developer to be able to look at production and say, is someone using my work? So that's really cool. So specifically in software, I do think observability. But then once you get beyond that to teams, I think relationships and having conversations with people is the best way.
Thank you.
Andrea has a question.
Hi. Can you comment on the length, how long you should run an experiment for?
Oh, okay. So how long should you run an experiment? Of course, it's going to depend on the experiment. But like if it's an A/B test, that gets into statistics. Like how many users do I need before I'm likely to get statistically significant results? Because like what's the randomness here? So if you can get a lot of users, you may only have to run it for a few hours. But in our case, we have a couple thousand users at any given time. So we ran our A/B test for a month, maybe 3 weeks, something like that. So the answer in that case is until you get enough data. Now with your teams, in an experiment of we're changing our process, 2 weeks absolute minimum, preferably 4 to 6, so that the rest of the system has a chance to adjust. Because if you're switching to ensemble programming, you're like, bam, we're going to do all ensemble programming all the time. There's a lot to get used to there, and like, it's not as harsh as pairing in that, if one person leaves for a meeting or to go to the bathroom, the attention of the group continues. Whereas pairing, it kind of breaks it. But that there's a lot of, you don't know whether you like it immediately. First of all, you might only like it because it's new. But also you might only dislike it because the rest of the system hasn't adjusted to be compatible yet. So with people, it takes 2 weeks to form the habit, and then you can evaluate how that habit is serving you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just thinking about some other aspects of A/B testing and how they might translate to testing a process. Like A/B testing, sometimes there's a concept of you're running this test and you want to wait until you have a statistically significant number of users. But you see that an overwhelming number of people are going one way or the other way. And you're actually losing money if you don't switch to that way.
Well, what's the worst that can happen if you
so-
just switch to that way?
Right,
Go for
right.
it.
So, but, in terms of experimenting with your process, I guess, as you said, the same thing can happen. You don't like it the first week. You need to give it some time. Yeah, it's interesting just to think of the ramifications of
Yeah.
that. You do it for a week, everybody loves it.
Yeah, you do it for another week. Keep looking at the results. Do they still love it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it's interesting to think
Yeah.
about. Would you want to have a way of at what point you scale it up? At what point you don't scale it up completely? You mentioned that, but thinking about contingency plans based on how it's going, reevaluating how it's going during the experiment.
Yeah, keep looking at the results. Thank you. Okay, now really go get coffee quick before someone asks another question.